Hi everyone and welcome to the Commercial Awareness Compass. This is your weekly guide to developing commercial insight that goes just beyond the news. If you've been following the previous episodes, you'll be familiar with the format where we focus on one major story from the week. We break it down to help you build your understanding at three different levels. So this is beginner, intermediate and advanced. So whether you're new to commercial awareness or you've already got some understanding, the goal is kind of just help you move up the levels each week. And so we'll break down today's story in a way that's easy to follow and gives you some practical insights that hopefully you can build on and use in interviews or applications. So before we get started, I just wanted to introduce myself. So I'm Holly. I'm a future trainee solicitor who is currently studying the SQE. And today I'm joined by Henry, who is a lawyer and content creator. So Henry brings expert insight, which hopefully he's going to share with us today as we break down the story. So in today's session, we're going to have a look at the Diary of a CEO podcast and the topic of misinformation. So Henry, perhaps you could get us started by explaining the story a bit for our viewers.
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thanks for having me. So it's recently broke that a BBC Investigations found that Stephen Bartlett, the host of the ever popular Diary of the CEO podcast, has been sharing sort of misinformation around health and often failing to challenge debunked claims or sort of claims that guests have perhaps said, such as keto diets could help cure cancer, and hasn't sort of questioned the guests when they're saying that some vaccines are actually ineffective, which obviously is a huge cause for concern given the size of the platform. And experts have kind of warned that this content that's going out is sort of undermining trust in evidence-based medicine, which qualified professionals have spent years sort of developing, researching. And there's also a number of ethical concerns given that Stephen Bartlett's heavily invested or the owner of certain health companies as well, that the podcast kind of pushes out, such as Zoe and Huel, which you've probably all seen on the adverts for his podcast.
Perfect, thank you. And I'm aware that maybe some people after hearing that might be thinking that, what's a podcast really got to do with law? So perhaps you could explain its relevance or significance to commercial awareness generally.
Yeah, I think podcasts, we've all listened to them in various different forms, but they are becoming a lot more prevalent, and especially we're seeing a lot more sort of business owners, creators, people with influence having a platform and being able to share the voices and the opinions of a whole host of people across the globe. What's then being said on that could then have a level of cause for concern. And we then we have this balance between, do we allow sort of free speech? Do we allow people to say what they want? But also we need to make sure that these things are being said within the parameters of sort of regulatory rules, legislation, guidance, and that we're not, if we focus on the Stephen Bartlett podcast, for example, if we're talking about things that, let's take keto diets can solve cancer, or fundamentally, we've got whole hosts of doctors globally that have researched into this in terms of treatments, effectiveness, and all of that. So we need to make sure that that's being balanced around also allowing people to say what they want to say.
Thank you, that's really useful. And so just to get us started at this basic level, you've mentioned quite a few key terms that would be relevant in discussing this topic. Could you maybe explain some of them, perhaps starting with misinformation as a starting point?
Yeah, for sure. So there are a whole host of ways to explain it, but I guess the most simple one is, say I have a platform, I then use that platform to post content, information on the internet that's fundamentally not true. But the platform that I have is kind of accelerating it to spread across the internet. And we've seen it time and time again in terms of, if we take the, when was it? 2016, the Brexit campaign, and I think the Clinton-Trump presidential election in the US, we had the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which again was how misinformation was being spread, how it was being targeted towards certain groups, and ultimately the impact that that can have. Because if information is being spread, let's say, we'll stick with the keto diet curing cancer. If that's being spread at a level of Stephen Bartlett's podcast has sort of influence and reach, then if somebody is ill with, or unfortunately ill with, a terminal illness like cancer, and they're hearing this misinformation, they may then say no to actual medical treatment that can save their lives in lieu of, or in favor of, a keto diet.
Sure.
Which I think in themselves are questionable. So I think that's effectively it, the spreading of information that isn't true.
Sure, that's helpful. And perhaps could you maybe explain what the significance of advertising and monetizing in podcasting is?
Yeah, sure. It's really interesting. So podcasts themselves don't necessarily fit, or they don't, within the regulatory remit of the sort of Advertising Standards Agency authority's remit, in a sense that you may have seen specifically certain Love Islanders or reality TV stars have posted things on their social media platforms, and they've subsequently been fined by the ASA for being in breach of these rules. Podcasts in the podcast itself, not necessarily an advert within a podcast, isn't governed by any regulatory remit. So that doesn't necessarily assist in preventing the misspreading or the spreading of misinformation.
Sure, that's helpful to give us some context to what we're working within here. So just for our viewers at home, this has given us a bit of a basic overview of what's going on and, the key concepts arising out of the story, which gives us a sense of, why this does matter to firms and perhaps their clients. So as we move up the levels from this basic picture, I encourage you watching at home to be thinking about how each explanation that Henry provides builds on the last. And the ultimate aim here, of course, is to consider how law firms and their clients might be impacted as a result, and the strategic thinking that then might go on as a result of such, as to how they can help their clients manage these risks and the challenges that come with them. I kind of like to think of it as a bit of a pyramid, and felt that this is kind of like a useful way of approaching the topic in applications or interview answers. So we've just touched on a bit, but perhaps you could explain what regulation, for those that aren't aware of the rules around this sphere, exists around misinformation generally in social media or like marketing, advertising, like you said.
Yeah, for sure. So as we just touched on, there isn't currently a regulatory remit that governs podcasts within themselves. But I think possibly off the back of this, legislators, regulators may rethink that. There may be public pressures to actually start creating some kind of regulatory remit, which, as you just touched on, Ari, firms advising their clients, that's something that they will be looking out for, specific regulatory governance. PR teams that focus on this sort of area of law will be looking at to advise their clients in the future that this is coming up, or this is going through sort of the white paper process, and all of that. There are, however, certain regulations and rules that apply to advertisements and marketing communications. So if there is an advert within a podcast, or if an influencer, whoever it may be, is posting an advert on their social media for Huel or Zoe, or some other company, there are rules that they have to adhere to, and failing to kind of do this, and we saw it earlier this year actually with Stephen Bartlett, again with Zoe and Huel, that he didn't explicitly disclose, or there was a failure to disclose his interests in those companies, which would then in turn constitute a breach of these rules. And then if we take this back to sort of the law firm level, if Stephen Bartlett's coming to your law firm, it's for the lawyers to then say, here are the rules, and then apply those rules to the scenario in hand. Does it meet X, Y, and Z criteria? If it does, what's the outcome? It will be the law firm's job to prove why it doesn't meet specific ASA rules to show that there wasn't a breach. And that's the sort of role that you'll be doing as a lawyer within this sort of field.
Perfect. That's something I wanted to slightly move on to as we reach this intermediate level, is say other podcasters might have seen the article over the weekend and be concerned and perhaps consider going to law firms for advice on how they can make sure they stay themselves on the right side of the line. So I know you just mentioned a few, but what are some of the things that are going to be coming up in conversations between clients and law firms, and what they're going to be flagging in their advice to make sure we handle this?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest sort of takeaways from the Stephen Bartlett Diary of a CEO investigation that's come to light is in terms of the financial side of things, which we touched on in terms of having to disclose that sort of vested interest, and also the dissemination of the false or the misleading claims. And I think from what I've been reading around the Diary of a CEO podcast is that there was a lack of challenge from Stephen to say, why do you think that? Or where is the evidence to back this up? So I think clients should effectively be ensuring or reviewing the content that they are putting out. It's their responsibility. They're putting out that information. Can we fact check this? Are we spreading misinformation? Are we in breach of our sort of, if it's a regulated podcast, for example, or it's a podcast from a regulated industry such as medicine law, it's the person who's the guest on the podcast, what's their background, and just making sure that we're doing all the relevant due diligence that we can do to ensure that we're not falling foul of any current rules or any future rules that may come in the future.
Sure. And I know that obviously he brings, the whole point of the podcast is that he has guests on, and he says that he brings on influential people, experts and thinkers. And I think the aim that he tries to achieve in his podcast is about it being unfiltered, but this is obviously as a result brought around this issue. So what sort of claims would be being considered here against, is it just himself that's responsible, or is it the guests that are responsible? Where does that sort of lie, and what claims or disputes could be arising out of it as a result?
I think it's I'm not a litigator, but I think ultimately a lot of the responsibility from my perspective would be that it sits with Stephen and his company. And we touched on this earlier, that there is no direct statutory regulation of podcasts and that specific content. But we could potentially see under sort of the common law that potentially maybe Stephen owed a duty of care to his listeners. And as a result of the misinformation that has come from a guest on his podcast that he hasn't necessarily challenged or fact checked, that you, me, or some other listener suffers harm, whatever that harm may be. One of the issues we would then see is, did Stephen actually owe a duty of care to his audience? And I think it may be quite difficult to show that he did. That would be a discussion for the relevant legal teams to have. But there might be a time, or it could come up, that because a lot of health information is being provided by Stephen's guests, that actually, and that information is harmful, that actually maybe that boundary has been blurred and he did in fact owe them a duty of care. And again, that's something that if you're sitting within a litigation team, at your firm, these are the sorts of conversations that you would be having if such a claim was going to go through the litigation process. If you're acting for the claimant or the defendant, if you're the claimant, it'll be on you to sort of show that actually a duty of care did stand for X, Y, and Z reasons. Defendant, we denote your duty of care because X, Y, and Z.
Sure, yeah, no, that's useful. And I think it's really important to flag here, as you pointed out, that understanding this within the context and being able to explain, why does this matter to businesses, and how law firms can then assist their clients is vital. And so zooming out a bit, for those thinking a bit more strategically about the bigger picture as we move towards a more advanced level here, what can or could law firms be doing for their clients in trying to think a bit more in nuanced way in terms of adding value and getting ahead of the game, so to speak, beyond just immediate compliance or resolving issues like this one when they do arise?
Yeah, no, I think this space is huge, and I think it's only going to get bigger in terms of the content that podcasters like Stephen Bartlett are putting out, future podcast hosts. And we're seeing a lot of organizations now work with creators like Stephen Bartlett, work with a lot of other sort of influencers, reality TV stars, people with influence within the media to sort of advocate for their business or work with their business. So I think alongside doing the usual horizon scanning to see what's coming up and what are the regulators going to do to keep on top of the changes in this space, because I do think off the back of this BBC investigation that we are going to see something or some kind of shift, or at least an inclination that actually the regulators might be more tough on what we see or how they kind of enforce and sort of check how creators, influencers operate. We've seen it before that, as we spoke about, the influencers have been fined, and I think we'll just see a lot more heavy-handedness from the regulators. But then it's for the firms to be checking this, and that will be your role as a trainee, to be horizon scanning, to see what's coming down the market, into the market, to be preparing sort of papers or sort of news updates for your clients to send out to say, this is happening, this might affect you working with X, Y, and Z. Maybe fact check that person to see what their background is. Do you really want to attach yourself to that person because we might have this risk in the future? And I think ultimately it's our role as legal professionals to advise our clients on making sure that whilst they step into these new areas like podcasts, like working with the Stephen Bartletts of now in the future, we're also balancing that and offsetting any level of risk. How can we mitigate the risks to ensure that the business is ultimately protected, because that's what our job is.
Sure. And so obviously we're thinking about the BBC and their approach to Stephen, but perhaps we could think about it from the other perspective. What might Stephen and his brand now be thinking about moving forward? Do they need legal advice? How are they going to move on from this? They're running a business at the end of the day focused on profitability. We know he's moved towards more of the health sector to produce more money. What can we consider about that?
Yeah, I think that he and his legal team would have been working very hard weekend just gone, but we're seeing a lot of firms now have reputation management, crisis management teams as a really exciting area to be in if you're a trainee qualified lawyer, because it's with the shift to sort of having an online presence now for so many people, personal branding and the impact of that. When you're somebody sort of the size of Stephen Bartlett, your reputation, your name, the whole Diary of a CEO podcast carries, particularly within the UK, such a level of kudos. He is going to be working with that team, the crisis management team, the reputation management team, to ensure that his reputation isn't damaged, because otherwise that is his business. And I think they will be going back through and sort of checking I'm not sure if their team I hadn't seen that they'd put in that statement.
No, I don't think they have. His label, I think, have, but not him himself.
Yeah, and I think we will see that by the end of this week. And it'll be interesting to see how it's worded. But ultimately, that's something that they will be focusing on, is the reputation management, the crisis management, and ensuring that they're not at sort of any risk of mass claims being brought sort of against them.
Sure, that's helpful. Thank you. And as you said, this is obviously a very fast evolving space. So can you envision any changes for podcasting or the creator space more generally in terms of what they promote and what they do generally to make sure they stay on the right side of regulations?
Yeah, I think it's clear and, for the most part, obvious to many, but not to everybody, that we cannot use platforms to be spreading misinformation. That's fundamentally wrong. The regulations don't allow that. We know that. But then we come into this sort of blurred space, like we probably we're seeing with Stephen and his podcast, is whose responsibility is it? If you have somebody on as a guest and they start saying, oh, this medication's rubbish, is it your responsibility then, arguably yes, to then challenge that and to say, why do you think that? And to give the necessary health warnings at the start of any podcast, or to get somebody who's actually a professional doctor also on the podcast to say, okay, that's your opinion, but this is why medically that's wrong. So you kind of have that balance. And I think at some point there will be litigation around this in terms of where the responsibility sits. So I think we will see a shift for sure.
That's really helpful. And yeah, I mean, it's a very fast evolving space. So I'm sure once we see his statement too, and then any litigation that follows. And is there anything that you think from your perspective is important to pull out here as anything that we haven't touched on?
No, but I would just echo what you just said in terms of it is a very fast moving space. And I think we'll probably similar to when kind of the internet started coming in, we had like, whose responsibility is it in terms of any misinformation that was put on the internet? Was it the internet service providers, or was it the actual individual uploading the content? I think we're going to see, again, the regulator sort of playing catch up with how fast the space is moving. But I think for those looking to kind of get involved in the profession, this is a very exciting time. There's so much going on right now. There are so many sort of tech advances in all different spaces. Even if we take like AI and misinformation, that's going to be another sort of hot topic in the future. So yeah, it's an exciting time, but you're completely right. It's very fast paced.
Well, that's been great. Is there anything that you could say about commercial awareness more generally from your experience for the listeners at home? As I know, conscious of it's December, so January is kind of crunch time for application season. Anything, tips from your experience?
Yeah, I think let's take this topic, for example, misinformation, sort of digital tech, and sort of all of this fun stuff. If this is a topic that you want to talk about to you, or even your application, and we touched on the reputation and crisis management teams as well, that's great. It's really cool. You can make this such a unique topic to talk about within the setting of a law firm, but actually make sure that this is an area of law that the law firm practices in. Because let's say we are applying for X firm and they don't deal with this. Whilst it's a great example, you cannot then take your application response to the next level. You can say the commercial awareness piece, but you can't necessarily then fit it within that law firm's particular context to say, this is the work that the firm has done, this is where I can see it going, this is how this is going to impact it. So just kind of, again, tailor your responses to like that particular firm and the work it does.
Definitely, super important. Nothing worse than getting in there and realizing you've gone down a rabbit hole of something that's not relevant.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially when you put in all that hard work. No, that's been super useful. Thank you. Perhaps maybe if you were in the viewers' positions again, preparing for an interview in January for a training contract, so one tip that you could maybe give them?
If I was heading into interview, is I would make sure that I always had a backup response to the various competency-based questions that you may get, because you could have one response and then the panel that are interviewing you may say, actually, no, we've heard that story enough times today from the news. Do you have something else? Just make sure that you've got something ready.
Yeah, no, I have heard of that, where you prepare your one news story and you've chosen this one and you've researched it and you've listened to this. And then they go, that's great, tell me another. And if that throws you, then, so yeah, really important to have multiple news stories prepared. Good job there's multiple episodes that people can be listening to.
Yeah, exactly.
Fab. So thank you. With that, I think we'll bring today's episode to a close. Thank you to our viewers for joining Henry and I today for today's Commercial Awareness Compass. So whatever level you've been working at, the key takeaway really is to approach every story with a curious and analytical mindset, and keep asking yourself, why does this impact clients and what would a law firm really do here? Since your role as a future lawyer will be to always provide strategic value. Thank you so much, Henry, for your time. And I wish everyone a lovely Christmas and New Year. I know that episodes will restart in the new year. So until then, continue to prepare without the panic. Thank you.